Hi everyone, this is Jerry, and this is a game between a former world champion, Jose Raul Capablanca, who's playing the white pieces, versus Edgard Colle, playing the black pieces. This game was played in Barcelona in 1929, and I think it's a good illustration of positional play by white, which ends with just a little tactic towards the very end of the game to finish black off. So as the game went, white starts out with pawn to c4, signaling the English opening, knight f6 development, knight f3 development, pawn c5, knight c3, knight c6, and what we have is a symmetrical English opening where both knights have been developed classically, and both c-pawns have advanced 2 squares. That symmetry ends with white's next move, pawn to d4, and that's often the case in chess. As soon as there is pawn tension or some exchange occurs, that's pretty much the end of any symmetry. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and black's next move pretty much puts him in some hot water. It's pretty much a rough road ahead after knight takes knight and queen takes knight, because this queen is very nicely placed in the center of the board and she isn't very accessible to the black pieces. She cannot be very easily chased away from this d4 square. Maybe a better continuation for black at this point in the game for move 5 is to just follow up with maybe pawn to g6 and play bishop to g7, or more specifically just to keep this tension between the knights and not help white out by developing their queen to the d4 square. But as it went, we had knight takes knight, queen takes knight, and now pawn to g6. Pawn to e4, making way for the bishop to develop. Pawn to d6. Don't get into the habit of having moves like pawn to g6. If you're playing the black pieces here, don't get into the habit of playing pawn to g6 and bishop to g7 back to back. You need to take into account the positioning of the white pieces. If you play bishop g7, you're going to have to cope with pawn to e5. The knight's attacked. If it goes to h5, pawn to g4 traps it. If the knight goes to g8, well, is that really how you want to be treating your knight? You came to f6 and now it goes back home. Probably doesn't want to have to do that. So instead of bishop g7 in this position, that's why pawn to d6 is played, to guard e5. So in the event of e5, the pawn could be taken. Bishop to e3, development, and white is actually already anticipating that this queen is going to be attacked. So when this bishop comes here, eventually white's going to want to retreat to d2, and that's why this bishop wants to first be developed to e3, so that the queen is on d2 and the bishop is on e3. Bishop to g7, pawn f3. Pawn f3 is directed at guarding g4 so that the knight can't make use of that square and attack the bishop on e3. Queen to a5, pinning the knight to the king and really raking this whole 5th rank. Probably better is just to castle immediately, making the move that you know you're going to have to make right away, instead of already telling white the address of your queen. But as it went, queen a5, and now queen to d2, breaking the pin on the knight and getting out of the view of this bishop. Pawn to a6, defending b5 from maybe a move like knight to b5, and also supporting a pawn to b5 advance. That's one of the breaks that black is trying to maybe get in this position, this pawn to b5. In many Sicilian defenses, black looks to get this pawn to d5 advance in, but that's all the more difficult as a result of this pawn being on c4. It's contributing to the defense of this d5 square, as is many other pieces. The e4 pawn, the knight on c3, the queen on d2, all of them are focused on this d5 square. So b5 is the next try, and it seems like that might be the one that's a bit more manageable to get in. Bishop to e2, development, preparing to castle. A good question here is why not play to d3? You know, what's the difference between the two moves? Well, take into account that this is a half-open d-file, since there is no white pawn but a black pawn, and the heavy pieces, namely the queens and the rooks, are going to want to have a clear view of this d6 pawn. But if the bishop is on d3, you're essentially putting a blindfold over the queen on d2. It cannot see this d6 pawn directly. So that's why we have bishop e2. Bishop e6 attacks c4. It's defended once and attacked once, so we could consider it unprotected, just as we consider this b7 pawn unprotected. The b7 pawn has 0 attackers, 0 defenders. It's unprotected. This c4 pawn has 1 attacker, 1 defender. We can consider that unprotected as well. Rook c1. Getting out of any potential threat along this diagonal. This rook might be susceptible to some tactics from this bishop on g7 after some pieces have moved, namely this knight. Eventually white wants to play pawn to b3 to have a pawn defend this c4 pawn, so as soon as this b2 pawn moves, the rook that was on a1 might have been a bit more susceptible to tactics. Rook c8 adding pressure to c4. Pawn b3 defense, and notice how this rook is no longer on the a1 square. Actually, there's been a couple moves made now. The queen and the rook have gotten out of the bishop's view of this diagonal. Now we have knight to d7, just having this bishop have direct view of the c3 knight, and the knight has possibilities of hopping to c5 or e5 at some point. White castles, black castles, and now we have knight to d5. A very forcing move. In fact, there's only one good reply from this position, seeing how this queen is unprotected and this knight is unprotected, how to cope with both threats. Unfortunately, queen takes queen, loses a pawn. Due to the in-between move, knight takes pawn check, king in the corner. Bishop takes queen. The end result is white is up a pawn. So, unfortunately, black is having to retreat the queen to its home. And now the queen, well, she's not ideally placed such that she has to essentially watch over a pawn. The knight is attacking the pawn, the queen is having to watch over the pawn. Not the ideal placement for a queen. Queen to b4, attacking an unprotected piece. You'll see that in many instances in this game. White pretty much puts pressure on black by attacking unprotected points in the position. So b7 is the unprotected point, so that's why we have this queen to b4 move. Bishop takes knight. How to recapture this bishop? Which one of these pawns do you capture with? Pawn on c takes bishop. The reason for that is to allow this rook more activity as well as this bishop. Notice that this pawn obstructs the view of this rook and this bishop. As soon as this pawn recaptures, this rook has more options, namely c5, c6, c7, and c8, and this bishop could potentially come to b5 or a6 at some point. Those aren't necessarily good moves, but at least more possibilities exist. So that's why we have pawn on c takes bishop. And this threat is still in the air, so how to cope with it? Unfortunately, black has to give up control of the c-file, or at least thinks that that's the way to best cope with this position. If the rook tries to go here to defend this pawn, that'll just run into bishop to a7, the rook's attacked, and as soon as it moves, queen takes pawn, so that's really not a good defense. So black chooses to swap rooks, gives white control of the c-file, a positional asset, and now queen to b8 defends the pawn. Queen to c4, a move directed at just pretty much saying I have control of the c-file. So there's no rook to c8 move. Bishop to b2 move, that's a difficult move to explain. It's pretty much an I don't know what to do move, because it doesn't really accomplish much. If anything, it actually improves the placement of the white rook. If I'm playing the white pieces here, I would much rather have my rook on a light square opposed to a dark square, since my opponent has one bishop remaining and that bishop is on a dark square. So I just, white plays the move rook to c2, and the bishop just goes to f6. So really what was accomplished, really not a whole lot with that move. It probably should have just come here right away. But as it went, we have now pawn to f4, preparing an advanced pawn to e5, and also taking away possibilities of the knight or even bishop coming here at some point. Rook to d8, just defending the unprotected knight. Queen to c7, really just welcoming exchanges. If queen takes queen here, rook takes queen, and the pressure is still pretty persistent. This rook is very nicely placed on the 7th rank, and these two bishops are functioning very well, focusing in the queenside direction. But black avoids the queen exchange and plays queen to a8, and now we have bishop to g4. Once again, notice that this knight is attacked once, defended once. We could consider it unprotected, so that prompts the move bishop g4, attacking an unprotected piece. Knight to c5, and white could go ahead and win a pawn here. The only question now is how to go about doing it. There's a couple different ways, probably the most direct way, and I'm sure this is still a good way to go about it, but white ends up choosing a different route. One way to do it is just bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and then queen takes pawn. White is up a pawn, and better in this position, if not winning. However, notice that this pawn is the only defender of this knight. This knight is attacked 3 times, and you can essentially try and deflect this pawn, the defender of the c5 pawn, so that's what prompts pawn to e5. If pawn takes pawn, now we win the knight. So unfortunately this pawn can't move, and the bishop's being attacked, so we have bishop g7, and now the unprotected piece is the pawn on e7, so that falls. Pawn to h5, a move directed at, I'm thinking, not only to allow the king an additional square to run to, but to turn this bishop into a one-dimensional piece. From g4, it's functioning along 2 diagonals. I think black is trying to, I think black is threatening it to make it maybe go to h3, where it's just a one-dimensional piece, just functioning along 1 diagonal. But a little calculation was done here by white, and the game ends in just a handful more of moves. We have pawn to e6, and if pawn takes pawn, we'll just have bishop takes pawn. The 7th rank is now a bit more vulnerable. That's essentially what this move is doing, this pawn to e6 move. By making this f7 pawn flinch, or just move forward or capture, these g7 and h7 squares are more vulnerable, especially if a rook is allowed to get to c7. As was played in the game after pawn to e6, black actually goes ahead and accepts the offer, pawn takes bishop, and that runs into pawn takes pawn check. If the king goes into the corner to mate in 2, queen to h4, bishop block, it's the only move, queen takes bishop mate, but black ends up playing king to h7, and that only delays the inevitable for a few moves. Queen h4 check, bishop block is the only move. The bishop is now in a pin. The way you treat that is to usually attack the pinned piece. So pawn to f5 will do that. Allows the bishop to attack it. Pawn g4, this is already a resignable position. Bishop takes pawn, king g7, queen takes bishop, and black resigns. And for good reason. If king takes pawn, well, that would be the only move. That'll run into queen to f6 check. If king here, that's mate. And if king here, that's just going to run into queen takes rook, and white is essentially up a rook and actually a couple pawns, which is equivalent to a win. So that's all for this video. I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.